a growing number of South Koreans have voiced support for the building of nuclear weapons here at home in light of North Korea's nuclear brinkmanship. Accordingly, some former US officials have proposed the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea. So what are the prospects of nuclear weapons here in South Korea? And is it time to seek new answers to old questions about global stability and security? Ultimately, what looks to be the impact of the Yoon-Biden summit on geopolitical concerns? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Ahead of the Yoon-Biden summit scheduled to take place Wednesday local time in Washington, D.C., we shed light on concerns here on the local front about the state of South Korea's security in light of North Korea's nuclear weapons ambitions. For more on this, I have Dr. Bruce Bennett from RAND Corporation here in the studio with me. Dr. Bennett, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's an opportunity for me.
Right. Dr. Bennett, senior U.S. sources have said that the upcoming summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. President Joe Biden will see the U.S. president sharing substantial steps with regard to reaffirming U.S. commitment to South Korea's defense amid North Korea's nuclear threat. What steps do you envision?
Well, I think we have to go to what President Yoon said in January. In January, he said, these nuclear weapons are U.S. weapons. But we should be doing joint work more on intelligence collection, on planning of nuclear weapon use, and in training. So intelligence collection, what you would want to hit with a nuclear weapon if you ever had to in North Korea. Planning, how we would do it, what we would do, and training really has to start with some tabletop training because we just don't have the background in how you deal with an adversary with 50 or 100 nuclear weapons. That's a very different environment to deal with in a war.
So this is more training then?
More training. Training, but not going out in the field and dropping weapons. It's training to know how to handle the problem.
Right. Dr. Bennett, personally speaking, do you suppose Washington could do more to reassure Seoul?
Oh, absolutely. And the key question there is, what's causing the anxiety in Seoul? I think the anxiety is being caused by many subjects, but let's consider just a few. The provocations from North Korea are a big contributor. We also are concerned about the growing North Korean nuclear weapon program. It's not stopped, it's growing flat out, and Kim says it's going to go exponential. In addition, Russia and China are refusing to do anything to rein in the program. So they're causing anxiety by taking that kind of position. Now, there are other issues we can talk about, but as you look across those things, there are things that the U.S. and South Korea ought to be doing to put pressure on North Korea, to get it to rein in that program and stop the provocations and not just deter warfare.
And given these latest events, Dr. Bennett, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton spoke about the need to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's something we can do, but think of the political chaos that could cause in Korea. So I think the U.S. and South Korea need to take a more incremental approach. Let's do some simple things first to put pressure on North Korea, to tell them you need to rein in. If you don't, we will do this, and then we will do that, and then we will do this. And eventually we get to deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. But it's not something that I would immediately jump to.
Right, I see. Some scholars, Dr. Bennett, have spoken about how in the event of a seventh nuclear test by North Korea, South Korea should withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And should North Korea decide to pursue their nuclear ambitions, then South Korea itself should also begin to build its own nuclear arsenal. How do you respond?
Well, I think we have to be careful there. The fact that we need to do something is absolutely right. But the something of going in South Korea building its own nuclear arsenal is probably not right, because think about it. North Korea has uranium deposits where they can make uranium for weapons and for power. South Korea, as far as I know, does not. So there's a nuclear supplier group. They provide that uranium. If you leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they're not going to provide you that uranium anymore. So what happens when 30% of South Korea's energy supply over several years goes away? Just as one example of a sanction that could occur. So there are ramifications of going nuclear for South Korea which are really negative, and alternatives for covering the problem which are also possible and probably handle the situation.
And one of the alternatives would be asking Washington to share its nuclear weapons with Seoul. But Seoul has been talking about having a different kind of sharing program from the one that Washington shares with NATO. Could you explain that for us?
Sure. In NATO, what we do is we literally have weapons based on allied bases. So in Germany, there are nuclear weapons on a German air base. There is an American officer and a German officer who each have a key. And if we ever have to use nuclear weapons, they have to both insert the key and turn it. Then the weapon is activated and it's turned over to a German pilot to deliver it. The U.S. isn't very excited about that. That's not the best arrangement, we think. And so the U.S. would be reluctant for that kind of sharing. But if you're talking about sharing of our planning system, sharing of our intelligence, sharing of our training, as President Yoon asked for, those are easier asks and things that we really should be doing. I mean, think about it. If you're going to hit a target in North Korea with a nuclear weapon, according to Article 3 of your Constitution, that's South Korean territory. You're going to do that without the president of South Korea approving it? Not a great idea.
Right. And Dr. Bennett, against all the odds, if South Korea were to build its own nuclear arsenal, what kind of consequences, should I say, would it face from the international community? Would it be shunned like North Korea is?
Well, the nuclear supplier group, which I just mentioned, is one way that it would be problems, and you could lose your ability to make nuclear power and make nuclear weapons. Second kind of problem that you potentially run into is economic sanctions. The real difference between South Korea and North Korea is South Korea is an export-driven economy. Huge percentage of your GDP is exports, and if other countries decide to sanction South Korean exports, that could cause a huge disaster for the South Korean economy and the South Korean people. So those are things we need to avoid happening, because they really are bad results. Third kind of thing, of course, is will the U.S. alliance stay? If South Korea can handle its own problems with its own nuclear weapons, do you need the U.S. anymore? I don't think either from a U.S. perspective or Iraq perspective, ending the alliance is a good idea, but that question will come up.
Right, I see. Dr. Bennett, let's now touch upon advances made by North Korea with regard to its military and nuclear ambitions. There have been reports about underwater nuclear drone tests by the regime in recent weeks. How worried should we be?
Well, that drone, according to the information North Korea gave us, was traveling at a speed of about 8 kilometers an hour. 8 kilometers an hour is not enough to catch up with a naval force. The Russian drone that they have made that's like that kind of function travels at 70 or 80 kilometers per hour. It's got a nuclear power plant. So it can catch up with a carrier battle group and then explode and destroy it. So the North Korean threat is one of those threats that we see from North Korea, which is sort of kind of there, but not really all that threatening. But Kim is trying to create an image that he is powerful, both for his internal audience and for the external audience.
Right, I see. Also, Dr. Bennett, North Korea launched a new solid fuel ICBM this month. Now, pundits have voiced quite a bit of alarm regarding this particular development. What are your thoughts?
I started working on nuclear weapons in 1975. When we did that, we had Soviet ICBMs that were all liquid fueled. Now, they didn't go in and have a missile with no fuel in it and they had to fuel it before they could launch it. It had storable liquid fuel. So any time the Soviets decided to, they could have pushed a button and those ICBMs would have flown. So we look at the Soviet Scud missiles, which were liquid fuel missiles that North Korea got, that had to be fueled before you could launch them. They couldn't hold the fuel, it would have destroyed the missile over time. That's not what the liquid fuel is. That's the alternative to solid fuel. So the advantages of the solid fuel, sure, it's a good thing. It gives you some little bit of extra time, maybe, but if they have silo-based missiles, liquid fuel missiles can be launched right away.
Right, I see. Dr. Bennett, North Korea's Kim Jong-un has reportedly ordered officials to prepare the launch of the country's first space satellite. What are the implications of this particular reality? Okay,
so remember the pictures of Seoul and Incheon from the satellite that they shot in December? As in, you know, that's like 10 to 100 times worse than Google Maps. You know, if that's the kind of satellite North Korea launches, they're not going to get a whole lot of intelligence. They could do better just by going on the internet. So the question is, are they going to have cameras that are good enough to make a difference? Are they going to have electronic intercepts? They would probably have to get those things from Russia. Now, if they are giving Russia conventional munitions, artillery, whatever, what are they getting back from Russia? Maybe they are getting the things they would need for a satellite, or maybe a satellite is yet one more example of Kim Jong-un trying to look like he's really powerful, when in reality, maybe not so much.
So essentially speaking, North Korea's Kim Jong-un would have a strategic interest in helping Russia with its war in Ukraine then?
Well, he's got an interest in doing that because he knows that if he does that, the Russians are never going to do anything in the Security Council, and he's going to get some advantages from the Russians. He may even be getting nuclear weapon technology from the Russians.
Right, and staying with that then, do you believe, Dr. Bennett, that a seventh nuclear test by North Korea is inevitable? And if that is the case, what response options does the US and South Korea have? I mean, keeping in mind, like you mentioned, Russia and China's opposition to any sort of punitive measure.
So I think we have to recognize that Kim could do a seventh nuclear test today if he wanted to. He has weapons that are already existing that he could go out and explode. But what he wants to test is a small weapon that could fit on his theater missiles that would have enough of a bang to do what he's been saying they want to do. That's not a 5 kiloton, for example, less than the Hiroshima explosion. He needs something bigger than that, and that takes significant miniaturization. So my sense is he may be stuck not having enough miniaturization done. His people are still working on it, maybe getting advice and help from the Russians. With that in mind, eventually they'll do it, but they can't do 100 tests. They're only going to do 2 or 3 because of the international pressure. And so they're not just going to go and test one because it would be fun to test and make a difference.
All right. Dr. Bennett, the Korean Peninsula, it's been chosen as one of the potential 5 places where World War III could start. What, in your opinion, are the chances of a full-blown confrontation in this part of the world?
Well, I look at Kim Jong-un and I say, what terrifies him? What terrifies him is information. He doesn't want his people to have information. Remember, he called K-pop a vicious cancer that was undermining the morals of his younger generation and could cause the regime to collapse like a damp wall. That's the worst kind of thing possible. So he's going to send troops into South Korea where they would have unlimited access to K-pop, K-dramas, many other things. I think that's a nightmare for him. The only nightmare that's worse is that his army decides to rise up and throw him out. And so the danger, I think, is the instability that's already in North Korea because he can't feed people. If that grows too much, his military may take action or prepare to do that. And that's when he could decide to do something dramatic If he sends them south to invade the South, then they're not coming north to take him down in Pyongyang. So I think it's that instability that is a great cause of concern.
Right. And going beyond the region, Dr. Bennett, do you suppose Taiwan could be yet another? Because pundits have been talking about Taiwan being a potential place where World War III could begin. And we had the foreign minister of Taiwan talking about a war with China in the year 2027. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what we see is China's doing something of the same kind of thing that Kim Jong-un is doing. They're making serious threats, building up the military powers to be able to execute those threats potentially, because what they're hoping is that Taiwan is going to cave and say, okay, we give up, take us over. And the world will say, yeah, that's good, because it maintains peace. The problem, of course, is that kind of outcome may never happen. That's hopeful Chinese thinking. It's not very likely that the Taiwanese are going to want to say, oh, sure, we'd be happy to have what happened to us as what happened to Hong Kong. I can't imagine the Taiwanese people wanting that.
Do you see South Korea being able to take perhaps a sideline role in the case of conflict in the Taiwan Strait? Or do you think Washington will perhaps call on Seoul to take a more active role?
Oh, I think Washington will always want to call on all of its allies to support it in whatever action is required. But South Korea does have an important position, because the danger there is if China starts acting against Taiwan, lots of U.S. and other forces get diverted there. Kim may think, whoa, perfect opportunity to do something, whether it is an invasion or whether it is just coercive, in order to try and gain some advantages. So Korea would presumably want to maintain most of its military power at home in order to maintain security in that potentially escalatory situation.
Right. Dr. Bennett, earlier last week, President Yoon floated the idea of possibly arming Ukraine in the case of greater aggression by Russia with regard to civilians in Ukraine. Observers say that the Yoon administration has a strategic interest in aiding Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
So let's define strategic interest. I mean, strategic interest here is if South Korea does nothing, it's really serving the interest of Russia. Russia is not a consumer of South Korean products right now. If South Korea gains and supports Ukraine, it's gaining support from Europe, from the United States, and from many other countries who are the consumers of South Korean goods. So are you going to serve the desires of your consumer when you're an export-oriented economy? Or are you going to serve the desires of Russia, who could put some pressure on you, but in reality doesn't really have a lot of your interests in mind?
Also, during that particular interview with Reuters, in which he talked about potentially arming Ukraine, President Yoon implied tensions between China and Taiwan were not simply between those two places, but also a concern for the rest of the globe, including South Korea. Do you believe South Korea is moving away from its policy of strategic ambiguity? So,
strategic ambiguity works when adversaries are risk averse. When they are thinking that they need to avoid any risks, it works really well. But when they become risk takers, then it's not as good. So look at the North Korean provocations. Kim is not a risk taker with regard to starting a war, but he is a big risk taker with regard to doing provocations, and is doing that increasingly. When we have a strategic ambiguity policy, we're not going to rein in his provocations. We've got to have far more strategic clarity. And that's the part that I think sometimes our governments fail to recognize, is that the appropriate procedure is conditional on this situation.
Right, and hopefully some of that will be given shape during these summit talks between President Yoon and Biden later on Wednesday over in Washington, D.C. Dr. Bennett, let's end today's session on a light note then. Korea and South Korea and the U.S. mark 70 years of bilateral ties this particular year. Do you suppose this year will provide the two countries with a fresh momentum to perhaps reframe or reinvigorate their alliance?
Yeah, I think this is a time when both countries need to recognize that the alliance is very much in their interest. And it's not just militarily in their interest, certainly militarily, but politically, economically, the alliance is a very important thing for both countries. And I think as a result, both countries can take a lot of initiatives to tighten the alliance. But let me give you the anomaly. The U.S. and South Korea have been doing lots of military exercises recently because of Kim Jong-un's provocations. We've been escalating up. That creates a closer military alliance. When you train together, you learn how to work together. You build confidence in each other.
This is something you mentioned last time you were here as well.
That's right. And the bottom line is Kim Jong-un has been a great supporter of the alliance because he has pushed us closer together.
That's a very interesting perspective, actually, and it's quite right, I see. All right, Dr. Bennett, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Oh, certainly. My pleasure.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Thursday, where we cover actual details of the Yoon-Biden summit.